Okay, am I on? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, thanks, Ralph. I'll try to live up to that. So, yes, Ralph mentioned climate change, global warming. There it is. These are the data. Global temperatures since pre-industrial times, roughly 1880 up to the present. There's no scientific dispute about three facts. Number one, it's happening. Number two, it's us. Number three, it's not going to be good. No one in the scientific community is debating that. How bad can it get? Here's an extreme case study published by Stephen Sherwood and Huber in PNAS some time ago. A theoretical exercise just to imagine what would happen if we burned everything we can burn, which would take a couple hundred years. Well, we would up temperatures by about 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which has certain consequences, namely that a large part of the Earth would become uninhabitable. Wet bulb temperatures over 35 degrees Celsius make life unsustainable. You basically turn into scrambled eggs and die. That's what happens to your blood at that temperature. And if you look at some of my favorite countries, a large part of that planet would become uninhabitable. So the consequences that are out there, hundreds of years away, and there's a lot of reasons why I don't think we'll go to that extreme, consequences are pretty severe. And yet, we're not doing much about this. The question is why? Well, there are political, cultural, and technological reasons. The problem is not easy to solve. But on top of that, I think it is because there is an injection of misinformation and disinformation and propaganda into the public debate, and it is that injection of noise that is in part responsible for the delay in our action. And that is where it becomes a psychological issue, and that is where it touches on my research interests. And just to give you an example of the type of stuff I'm talking about, this is from not too long ago, an opinion piece in the Sunday Telegraph in the UK, and this character is claiming that official climate models are hopeless. None of them predicted a temporary fall in global temperature of 0.7 degrees, blah, 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 and even, then it all fell over and no one believes in climate change anymore. Okay, that's what this character was saying. Now, if you look at the data, just to give you an idea, 0.7 degrees is this much. I actually measured that against the scale on the left. Now, if you can detect a fall of 0.7 degrees anywhere in this graph, then congratulations, come and see me afterwards. That's a very interesting perceptual experience. Now, it took us a while to figure out where on earth this is coming from. And where it is coming from is that if you carefully pick 2 months a year apart, where it just happens that from January to January there is noise in the monthly data and the temperature drops 0.7 degrees, that is where you can selectively cherry pick the desired result and then say, climate change is a hoax, models are wrong, and so on. So that is the type of stuff that is out there. And for me, the framing of this is, and it's always crucial to frame a discussion in the right terms, to me that means that the public is denied the right to be adequately informed about the risks it's facing. That is basically what's going on. Climate denial is the denial of your right to be informed adequately about risks. So I think it's an important issue to understand, and I tried to understand denial a little over 10 years ago when I embarked on this weird journey that I want to tell you about, not because it's just my journey, but because it's pretty representative of what other people have experienced. Because throughout this journey, I've become enmeshed in a network of climate scientists and other people. I publish in climate science now, climate modeling papers and all that type. I became really immersed in this issue, and I learned that whatever was happening to me was also happening to other people. This is the timeline of my talk, a decade's worth of stuff. The open boxes are sort of key events that I will fill in, starting out with 2010, which apparently is when I first became interested in this, and I entered the public debate. I was living in Australia at the time, and I published an opinion piece on the ABC. This is a different ABC from the one from the previous talk. This is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And they have a website that is edited by one of their editors where, if you're lucky, you can post some opinion piece, which I did. And basically, I argued that the balance that matters is the balance of evidence rather than opinion. And I applied that to climate science, and the article kind of ran pretty hot and attracted thousands of comments. And lots of other interesting things were triggered by that. Little did I know that I would end up in a very peculiar place after I started publishing more opinion pieces. Why not? I became interested in this. I had stuff to say. I know about statistics. I know about risk trade-offs. So I thought this is interesting stuff to publish. And apparently some other people thought it was very interesting that I was publishing this because they started complaining to my university about the fact that I did this. And they tried to have me fired. That's nothing. So I'm not even going to spend any time talking about that because I got so used to that I no longer paid any attention. But I want to tell you about some strange stuff that started happening. So one day I'm sitting there, and this pops up in my inbox. Dear Professor Lewandowsky, we have something in common, a passionate concern for averting the looming catastrophe of runaway climate change. And I kind of thought, oh, whoa, that's a little hot. I recently began blogging, and after a month, my site was noticed by the wrong people. Readers of these Australian tabloids that you wouldn't know, so I left the names out, have swamped my site with genuinely abusive comments. How do you deal with monsters like this? And so I thought, oh, okay, got to reply to that. Okay, so I replied. I said, yes, I know all about those abusive comments because by that time they had been piling up in my inbox as well. They're like the school bullies who no one really liked and who didn't really have close friends, only followers. I thought, oh, that's a cool turn of phrase, And then I added, bear in mind that a proportion of those comments is orchestrated, and for all we know, there are only a handful of people with multiple electronic personas who are paid to create disproportionate noise. I said that, not knowing that I was talking to a sock puppet. Because what happened was, a few weeks later, I never heard back from her. A few weeks later, this whole thing popped up on a blog. And the person didn't exist. It was a sock puppet, an avatar, a bot, some person who pretended to be somebody else and who entrapped me into this email correspondence in which I warned her about bots, which I thought was really cool. This then hit the tabloids in Australia, and it was kind of like, literally, ha ha ha, look at how gullible Lewandowsky is. Climate change is a hoax, therefore. Right? Now, I don't know how my responding to somebody sending me an email identifies climate change as a hoax, but there you go. That is the logic of denial. So that was kind of, beginning, kind of like, gee, who would do that? I kind of thought that was strange. I was still laughing at it. I thought it was really funny. And so I kept laughing. Then I got this email. A little bit later. Lewandowsky, Jew, psychologist. God, he's ramping up. Lewandowsky, Jew, psychologist. Shut the fuck up, you Nazi Zionist kike. Okay, now. Okay. There's something here, there, that is kind of a little, maybe ironic in this. And I thought, that's very interesting. And I thought, why the Nazis? Whereas, I mean, the Jew is easy, that's always there, but Nazi, that's kind of weird. And then this came along, actually this is much later, but it fits in beautifully. Are you a global warming Nazi? People who label skeptics deniers will kill more people than the Holocaust, claims a scientist. Can you imagine that? So if I call climate deniers deniers, I'm killing more people than the Holocaust. Now, this didn't go over too well with the Anti-Defamation League, incidentally. But still, why Nazis? Other than that everybody always pulls out Nazis when they're, but is there a deeper reason? And I think the answer is yes. And I think this is very important to understand. Here is an executive summary from the IMF about subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And in a nutshell, this is from 2013, so it's old data, but it's not going to have changed by much by now. Fossil fuel subsidies globally amount to $1.9 trillion a year, 2.5% of global GDP. That's a massive amount of money that is being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. Now, a common objective of any climate mitigation policy, doesn't matter where you go in the world, a common objective is to reduce or eliminate these subsidies. How? Well, that's where people disagree. Some people want to put a price on carbon, other people want to regulate, et cetera, et cetera. There's different ways of doing it, but they all involve interference with the free market. And ironically, of course, the market isn't free at all because it is subsidized by $1.9 trillion a year. So that's another ironic twist on top of all the other ironies. But putting that aside, we have to do something by interfering with the market. And that is when some people lose the plot. Now, how many of you know of Hayek, von Hayek? Oh, okay, so good, most of you do. He was an Austrian economist, and he actually was Austrian, in addition to being an Austrian economist, if you get the pun here. And he wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, 1944, in which he argued that any interference with the economy inexorably will lead to totalitarianism, communism. He wasn't terribly concerned about fascism. They never are. They're always concerned about communism. And that theme has become an unquestioned principle of libertarian and right-wing thought, at least in Anglophone countries. Margaret Thatcher was carrying that book with her at all times, so I've been told, or so has Wikipedia told me. And in the US, Hayek got the Medal of Freedom from George H.W. Bush in 1991. Hayek is an extremely influential guy. Milton Friedman was one of the people who was his disciple, and all of that libertarianism can be, in part, traced back to Hayek. And I think it is for that reason that the overriding variable that predicts climate denial wherever you look is left-right political ideology, or liberal conservative political ideology, or free market fundamentalism, whatever you want to call it. This is a meta-analysis across 24 countries published by Hornsey et al. These are the effect sizes relating conservatism to denial. Huge in the US, large in English-speaking countries, and over all nations, including Germany, Austria, and so on, still a significant effect, although not quite as large as Anglophone countries. In my own data, half the variance in climate attitudes tends to be accounted by free market fundamentalism. I ask people 4 questions about the free market, and I know I have half of all possible knowledge about how they feel about the laws of physics. Okay? 4 questions about the free market, that tells me everything there's to know. And there's another consequence of that. And the consequence is that if there's overwhelming scientific evidence that is perceived as a threat for the reasons just mentioned, because it requires interference with the free market to deal with this, if that threat is perceived, and if necessarily most scientists agree, as they have to, because otherwise there wouldn't be overwhelming scientific evidence. In the case of climate change, we know that about 97% of all experts and 97% of the literature is agreeing on the three fundamentals that I mentioned at the outset. If that is the case, well, then they must be involved in a conspiracy. How else can you explain away the consensus? I'm an Austrian economist. Here are these hippies telling me to put a tax on carbon, which I know will lead to communism by tomorrow. Hence, all the scientists who are supporting this clearly must be involved in a conspiracy. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He's a US senator from Oklahoma. I used to live in Oklahoma, and I used to know him back then. He's a special kind of guy. He wrote a book, The Greatest Hoax: How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. Totally unsurprising. Pretty much every book out there that's critical about climate change will be advancing a conspiracy theory of one form or another. And unsurprisingly, by now, if you look at the literature overall, you find a consistent negative association between the endorsement of conspiratorial thinking and the rejection of scientific propositions, including climate change. And the range of that association is, between 0.2 and 0.57. These are correlation coefficients, but negative. So the more conspiracism, the less you will accept climate science. And you can see my name on there because what triggered everything that follows from here on was because I published one of the first papers to establish that link, and since then it's been replicated numerous times, and I'm now taking this totally for granted as I continue to tell you about my story. So the next thing that happened was that I published this paper I just mentioned in Psychological Science in 2012, called NASA Faked the Moon Landing, Therefore Climate Science is a Hoax. From here on, I'll call that log 12, Lewandowsky, Oberauer, Gignac, and then it actually became available in 2012 in press, even though it wasn't published in the journal till 2013. But I just needed an acronym for the paper, so that's what I'll be talking about now for a while. What did the paper show? Well, this is the core result. That's a structural equation model of a survey involving more than 1,000 people whom I recruited from climate-related blogs. Anybody who went to the blogs was given the link, click on here, do the survey, and they did. I got about, I can't remember now, over 1,000 people. And the crucial relationship is this. The more people endorsed some conspiracy theories, the less they accepted climate science. Now, that's a very modest correlation, but it was significant. And note how much smaller it is than the association between free market ideology and rejection of climate science. Nonetheless, it's there, and believe me, it replicates. And anybody who knows anything about climate denial, when I published this paper, they looked at me and they said, yeah, really? That's like saying Republicans don't like paying tax. It's so obvious, this association, that none of the people who know anything about denial were surprised. However, other people were surprised. And so now I want to tell you a little bit about what happened in response to me publishing this paper. There are two branches here because some of the response was publicly visible And some of it was what I call subterranean. This is when we turn to these intimidations and emails and threats and all that stuff. So let me tell you a little bit about what went on. And bear in mind that what I'm telling you about is the tip of the iceberg for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't have time to tell you everything. That's the primary reason. But there's also a lot of stuff I can't talk about, even to this date, for a variety of complicated reasons. By the time I'm finished, you'll understand why I'm saying that. So, what happened? Well, what happened was that as soon as the paper got published, the climate denial blogosphere erupted into a tizzy of activity. Because in the methods section, I noted that 5 skeptic or skeptic-leaning blogs were approached, that is to post this link to my survey, but none posted the link. Only pro-science blogs did. Well, that was what I said in the method. That was true. Guess what? Of course it was true. Now, in the blogosphere, all the bloggers were saying, well, who did he contact? It wasn't me. So they put up a list, and about 20 people said, oh, it wasn't me, he never asked me. Who did he ask? Who are these 5 blogs? So this went on for like weeks. That was very interesting. And here, for example, just to illustrate, is one comment by one individual on a blog who says, oh, if the claim was fabricated, then that would be misconduct. Oh, and very helpfully, the person who's responsible for investigating these misconduct affairs is the following pro-VC for research. Here's her email address. Now, there's 2 things that are notable about this particular claim. The first one is that this guy had been contacted twice by me, well, actually by my RA, which he'd forgotten about. And the second thing is that posting email addresses of scientists or university officials is a routine tool among these guys, because all they got to do is put up the address, drop a little hint, and then right on cue, the complaints started rolling in. This is one addressed to that pro-vice chancellor for research. Professor Lewandowski's research and paper, obvious scientific fraud. Then there's a very long list of links to blog posts, all by the same crowd of people citing each other. And then, failure to take appropriate action will look like the University of Western Australia is complicit in this fraud. It will destroy the reputation of the university. Well, there was like dozens of these, if not hundreds. And then some were addressed to me. This is a guy telling me, I'm stunned by the sheer dishonesty and cavalier attitude. Withdraw the paper or hand in your PhD, wherever you got it from. Cornflakes packet, I suspect. Get your things together. You'll be leaving soon. Okay. Now, these are mild, right? I sort of, there's some juicy stuff there. So, you know, addressed to me, addressed to the vice chancellor. And then it was absolutely gorgeous. One guy made the mistake of accusing the pro-VC of being a mediocre scientist who you know, probably shouldn't be teaching in primary school. And that was a mistake, because the vice chancellor then got really angry and wrote a letter back to this person saying, well, actually, Professor so-and-so has taught at Berkeley, got a PhD from here, has published 300 papers, and you're just a fucking idiot. He didn't say that, but that was the tenor of the letter. And that was good for me, because if you insult a pro-VC, that's not a good thing to do when you're complaining about an academic, right? So if anybody ever complains about you, just egg them on to insult somebody higher up than you. That is really cool, because then they're siding with you, because they know who they're dealing with. So is that skepticism, by the way? Because these people call themselves skeptics. Well, I don't think so. I have some data showing that skeptics, properly defined, are actually much better information processors than people who are not skeptics. So, for example, in those 2 papers, I showed that people who did not accept weapons of mass destruction as the reason for the invasion of Iraq were much better able to differentiate between true and false war-related news stories than people who thought it was all about weapons of mass destruction. So skeptics are more accurate information processors. But a nihilistic degree of skepticism, where you believe absolutely nothing anybody tells you, has been identified as an attribute of conspiratorial thinking. And I began to notice that. These guys were complaining about me showing an association between climate denial and conspiratorial thinking. So what do? They collectively act like conspiracy theorists in public to prove my point. And I thought, wow, there's a research opportunity here. So I started collecting these responses. And here's another one from a blog, some random blog. The survey was so transparently designed to link climate skeptics with nutters. It would hardly be surprising if a percentage of warmists, that's people who accept the science, wouldn't, do their duty. In other words, they would fake the data, they would scam the survey with pseudo responses just to impugn deniers. That's another element of conspiratorial thinking, to impute questionable motives on the people underlying the presumed conspiracy. So tick, another one. Oh, getting better and better. Then this whole scamming idea that my data were not real data but were fake, that just took off entirely. So by a wonderful application of circular logic, the first step in the logic was, well, no one in their right mind would ever endorse a conspiracy theory. Therefore, anybody in my survey who did was just faking that response. Well, that's great, because then you define the phenomenon out of existence. Because anybody who is a conspiracy theorist actually isn't. They're just pretending to be, right? That reminds me of a lot of tinfoil hats, but never mind. So that was how they started out. Then it was 3/4 of people who disagreed that fossil fuels increase atmospheric temperature. They were also scammers, based on an impression. The 48 people who were free market zealots, they also scammed, because no one would actually do this. So basically, what they did was to apply another aspect of conspiratorial thinking, namely that something must be wrong, and only me, the conspiracy theorist, except I don't call myself that, I call myself a skeptic, only me, the skeptic, is in possession of this unambiguous detector that can identify, in this case, who scammed the survey. But there's more to the scamming idea, because reanalyzing quote-unquote data by getting rid of inconvenient observations, that is a technique that's being used everywhere. The tobacco industry did that. Anybody who died from a heart attack and had smoked for 30 years was somehow ineligible for the data set because, shoe size, or something. Color underwear, no, that's, There was always something to throw these people out, and that is how climate deniers and the tobacco industry and the people who were attacking my data, that's how they operate. So that was all very interesting. This was the public part. Now, the dark side was something that I eventually also wrote about. And just to put it into context, here's an interesting snippet from a newspaper in Canada, or it's reporting, it's Fox actually, weirdly, a break-in at another climate research center. Persons were found to impersonate technicians in a bid to access data. So these guys literally showed up, you know, dressed in blue overalls, tool belts, everything. Oh, we're looking at your computer here. You know, we've been ordered to fix this computer. And then they kind of walked into the lab and tried to run off with the climate modeling computer at the University of Victoria. I mean, this happens all the time. Not anymore as much, but back then, this stuff was routine. You may have heard of ClimateGate. This was a pseudo-scandal that was cooked up by people hacking into a huge trove of email that was among climate scientists. It was released right before the Copenhagen climate conference. I personally think it had an impact on that conference and delayed political action on climate change. I have very little doubt about that. And it was a non-scandal. Climate scientists were exonerated 9 times in 9 different inquiries. But it was a wonderful tool at the time. And the list goes on and on and on. And in my particular case, in the background, systematic attempts were made to suppress the publication of Log 12 and to have it retracted. Now, I then thought, well, daylight is a good disinfectant. So I wrote an article in the APS Observer. And the Observer had their own editorial piece, which I'm excerpting here. They backed me up. And that's good, except it didn't stop anything. Because the next thing they did was to resort to freedom of information. Of course they did. They always do, asking for emails. My last FOI request was last year or something when I published a paper they didn't like. They wanted all my correspondence for the last 18 months. So in this particular instant, the FOI request revealed that the study had been conducted with ethics approval. Thereupon, one individual took it upon himself to write a letter to the editor of Psychological Science saying Lewandowsky did not receive informed consent from the ethics committee at the University of Western Australia. It's kind of like, what? I mean, the opposite was in the email that they got through FOI. So I thought, okay. And the deputy VC, mentioned before, wrote a letter to the editor of Psychological Science saying, well, actually, the research was conducted in compliance with all applicable ethical guidelines. But the whole time, the editor was bombarded with emails calling me unethical and accusing me of not having ethics approval and this, that, and the other, even though, and they were all referring to this FOI. It has become available through freedom of information that Lewandowsky did not have ethics approval. Well, no. What became available was the approval. So by 2014, I was aware of 7 attempts to suppress papers in climate science or affiliated areas, topics, and that number is probably an underestimate. But I learned then that it was a routine procedure to just bully editors. And we'll see a lot more of that later. Now, I was okay, well actually I wasn't okay with that. I was getting to be a little peeved by that. But I do know of scientists who have given up working on topics because of this. I know that women are particularly targeted by that. And I've written 2 papers arguing that these incessant attacks have actually made a change to the way how climate scientists themselves are conducting their science. And I would argue, this is contested, contentious, but I would argue that climate scientists have not informed the world of the full envelope of risks consistently, in part because they're being asymmetrically attacked whenever they say anything that might cause alarm. Freedom of information. You know, it's really funny when somebody starts crawling through your email and then puts it on the internet, quote mines it, turns it around, upside down, invents stuff, you're beginning to think, well, this is sort of weird because it is like privatizing the Stasi. And that is effectively what's happened in many jurisdictions, in Australia, in the US, Canada, less so in Britain. But anybody now can say, your email is a public document, I want to see all of it. Now, they won't get all of it because there are sort of constraints on this, but they will get a lot of it. And as a scientist, you basically have to accept that. There's no way around it unless you use telephones. And it's amazing how much I've rediscovered this ancient technology of actually calling people on the phone because, you know, it doesn't leave a written trace. Anyway, that's just an aside. It also is sometimes amusing when somebody is asking for a printout of the web server log showing the precise time, hours and minutes, and date of publishing at the relevant time zone to which this refers. That was one of my Freedom of Information requests. What? Why would anybody want to know that? Well, I replied to that in this article in The Observer saying trivial pedantry such as the precise time and date of my blog post. I basically accused them of being pedants. To which the reply was, oh, the timestamp is relevant to my untrue claim to have had priority in outing skeptic bloggers. And then I went on, I don't even know what that means, really. But what I can show you is the interface of my old blog at the time. And this is what you do. You type a blog post, and then you stick in a date and a time. And, you know, I kind of have a look, and I kind of put in a time, you know, and then I might have a cup of coffee before I press the publish button. So, I mean, Jesus. It never occurred to me that this is a crucial thing that I have to time to the second. But they won't accept that. And the fact that they don't accept it is another attribute of conspiratorial thinking. Nothing is an accident. Everything must have a purpose. Something must be wrong. That's typical conspiratorial thought. There is no explanation that could be just an accident or chance or sloppiness or just a weird interface for a blog where the date and time is just sort of, I don't know, I just stick it in there. I don't know what time zone it is. If I'm in the UK, I look at my watch and, you know, who knows? So, anyway, what happened was I kept track of all the stuff I just told you about, what I called recursive theories about log 12, my paper. Here's a complete list of them. I thought this is fascinating. I could classify them all in you know, like this is that attribute of conspiratorial thinking. Tick, tick, tick. You know, I had a matrix of all this public discourse. That made my point. So I published 2 papers in 2013. One was a replication of the first finding, so I was very pleased by that. And the second one was called Recursive Fury. And that reported a conceptual, textual analysis of the response to log 12 by the blogosphere. And we concluded that, hey guys, we triggered something interesting here by publishing a paper about conspiratorial thinking. We actually triggered all that, and look here, this is how it happened. And this, at the time, to the best of my knowledge, became the most read paper in Frontiers in Psychology up to that point. Now, I mean, look, you know, that was my wife doing me a hell of a favor by going through all the journals that year. Maybe this is wrong, but, you know, it was it was a bestseller. The New York Times picked it up, and it was really cool. It was a great paper. But the story doesn't end there. There's a lot more going on. I just briefly want to ask or suggest why this research is important. Because some people ask me, why do you bother with this? You know, what's the point? What's going on? My reply to that is, well, you know, look here. Here's a journalist in the Telegraph basically threatening one of the world's leading climate scientists with the electric chair for being a climate scientist. Now, that idea didn't just originate in that guy's head, although in that head there's a lot of stuff. But there is a direct link from blogs where this thing is pilot tested, market tested. It then goes into the media, and from there it flows to the politicians. And you can trace out denial along that route. It starts on blogs, goes to the media, ends up in Parliament or Congress or somewhere else. So I think it is important to understand what's going on, and it's also important to get it right. So I want to deal with some potential objections to what we did and to recursive theory, which was looking at the response to our paper. And the first objection was that we just did a textual analysis ourselves and we were an involved party, so you were biased, etc., etc. So we ran an experiment in which blind and naive subjects were given the blog content, some of the stuff I just showed you, all that stuff, all these accusations. And we asked our participants to rate the extent to which the content imputed questionable motives, expressed deep-seated suspicion, expressed the belief that something must be wrong, all these criteria I mentioned about conspiratorial thought. And if you look at the data, this is what you get. Now, I've been in the field for quite a while, and I've never seen distributions like that before. Because normally you get a bell-shaped distribution. Well, not here. The modal response for every single item was the maximum. 9 out of 9, 9 out of 9, 9 out of 9. This is over hundreds of content items, always saying, yeah, this is expressing suspicion. This is assuming questionable motives. This is, something must be wrong. So there's independent validation of our analysis because on those criteria, blind and naive subjects come to the same conclusions as we did. Now, for comparison purposes, we also hired some PhD students to be as critical as possible of log 12, the same paper, and we tasked them anonymously, so we didn't know who was doing this, to write blog comments that were incredibly critical. We just told them, tear apart the paper, don't leave anything unturned, be critical, be critical, be critical. And interspersed with the denialist blog content, our participants also saw the PhD-generated control material. And those are the dashed lines and shaded distributions. And look how different they are. So if you ask PhD students to be critical, you don't get the same extent of conspiratorial thought. And that's important to show because I'm always a little concerned that maybe this denial is just a way for like a tool to get at the truth, even though it's kind of ruthless and harmful if you're at the receiving end. Maybe there's something to it. Well, doesn't look like it. And here's one last question we asked in that study about the blog content. Is this reasonable, well thought out criticism of the research? What you see here are the blind judges' responses to the blogosphere denialist content. And what you see there is what the PhD student content shows instead. And that's where you get a complete reversal. The PhD student content is seen to be incisive and valid criticism. The modal response for the blog content is 0. So no, in the eyes of those blind judges, there's no benefit to this denial. Now, a further criticism that I hear all the time is, why don't you talk to these people? They're human beings. Oh, you should have a nice conversation with them. Okay, I did. I have. All of us have. Here is one exchange I had with a person who got in touch with me and said, I'd open the private dialogue, better understand each other. And I said, yeah, okay, cool. Then I replied by sending him some papers. You're interested in expert forecasting. There's a literature out there. I sort of had a constructive reply. He replied, thanks, that does look relevant. Ooh, but I can't pay. Maybe I'll find something else. All, nice. I thought, yeah, okay. A day later, I get this. Same guy. I had hoped to work toward a better understanding between us. It is clear to me that you have not adhered to the proper ethics of... What? I had no idea. And then this guy puts that on his blog. I think Lewandowsky is in the pay of big oil, and he's a part of a conspiracy to make skeptics fearful of suggesting there's a conspiracy, so that we dare not mention that this is a real conspiracy to make us think there's another conspiracy to make us miss the real conspiracy that isn't there. Honestly, yeah, you want me to talk to people like that? Well, I've tried. But, there comes a point when, you just got to say, well, not really. This is not an isolated instance. Of course, climate scientists replied to emails and engaged with these people 20 years ago. And then they all had experiences like this. Here is a geophysicist from the University of Washington. He put this on his blog post. He said, many of my colleagues warned me not to trust the good intentions of X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z are my friends too. I have ignored them, evidently to my peril. So, some people you can't talk to. So, which brings me to the next stage, because now guess what? I just published a paper, a second one, actually the third one in the sequence, and the one that focused on the reply by the blogosphere to my first paper. What do you think happens? Well, of course, what happened was that there were hundreds of complaints, hundreds of pages of printouts, just a quantity of information that exceeds human comprehension that was sent to the journal, to the university I was at, to me, less so to me. They were much more interested in talking to the journal and the university and everybody else. And in consequence, Frontiers took down the paper with this notice. And that notice was up for a year, roughly. Now, the reason they did this was because they were scared of British libel laws. I didn't know anything about libel laws when I started this. Now I do. Let me explain the old British libel law to you. Establishing malice is an important part of a libel case. So if you want compensation from me because I said something libelous about you in public, then you have to show that I was acting with malice, rather than stupidity or accident or, like coincidence or something. You actually have to prove my intent, my malice. Okay? So how was my malice established? Well, like this. Two people who were not authors and whom I have never met made disparaging remarks about X in a private online forum that was password protected, never intended for public consumption, that was hosted by my co-author, John Cook, right? Get that? So two people over here talk in private on a forum hosted by Cook, who's a co-author. Then somebody hacks that private forum in a very sophisticated operation. We have enough IT expertise to trace all this down. We wrote a story about how the hack was conducted, and if you're a geek, you're welcome to this, because we have some pretty cool network guys working for us. The information was leaked and then became public. And on that basis, we were accused of malice. So imagine you're hosting a party, you're inviting two people, or you're inviting 20, and two of them, you two, talk to each other in a corner where, I don't know, you say something bad about a person who's 10,000 miles away, then apparently I'm guilty of malice, if your conversation is illegally wiretapped. That is what happened here. That is how we were accused of malice. With success. Because Frontiers asked us to produce a replacement paper that we were invited to submit to fix these problems. So we did. And you would think that's all good. But no, Frontiers decided not to accept our replacement paper, which conformed to their instructions, and instead chose to retract recursive theory. They put this message on the blog, which incidentally was signed by my lawyer and by their lawyers, and I have the signatures in the document, so it's a fairly legally binding contract. And it said this investigation, they investigated us, of course, did not identify any issues with the academic and ethical aspects of the study. It did, however, determine the legal context insufficiently clear, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so they retracted the paper. Boom. All hell broke loose. Wow, what do you think happened next? Lewandowski's almost dead. I'm almost buried, my career is over, everything is exploding. Well, that's sort of what happened, but it didn't quite happen according to plan. At least not according to the denialist plan. It happened more according to our plan. Because the first thing that happened is that the Australian Psychological Society expressed their dismay at the retraction. And they said that they want to be kept informed, they're happy to field media inquiries, and they basically supported us. And this was a public document, and I made sure a lot of people saw that. The University of Western Australia, their lawyer said, I'm entirely comfortable with you publishing the paper on the UWA website. You and the university, this is gorgeous, you and the university can easily be sued for hurt feelings or confected outrage. And I'd be quite comfortable processing such a phony legal action. Oh, that's great, right? If you get a lawyer to say that in public, and this was all over the Australian papers, that's pretty good. Not so good for the journal. And so, of course, I put recursive theory up on the UWA website. It's been downloaded 13,000 times. It carried a statement that affirmed the University of Western Australia's commitment to academic freedom. And more happened that didn't quite go according to the plan of the deniers, and possibly not the journal, although I'm not privy to their thought. 3 editors of Frontiers resigned in protest over the decision. And of course, that was all public, all over the media. The Union of Concerned Scientists expressed concern. Well, yeah, they're a union of concern, you know. What do you expect? You know? What else would they express? And one of the original reviewers wrote an article in Scientific American that was a firecracker. And this is what she said. The journal's management and editors were clearly intimidated. So they bowed to their demands, retracted the paper, damaged its own reputation. And she went on just, wow, man, that was a really cool piece. And by that time, the journal didn't look so good. And then it becomes incredibly complicated. And that's why I'm putting up this quote by Robert Mann, who's one of Australia's leading public intellectuals, and he captures it perfectly. These guys produce so much pedantry and pettifoggery that normal people just can't follow it. So there's a hell of a lot more here going on. That is all very interesting, but impossible to talk about. So instead, I'll tell you about recurrent theory, not recursive, recurrent theory, which rose again in 2015, 1 year after recursive theory was retracted. Now, there's a couple of things that are remarkable about this paper. The first one is that as of today, it's been downloaded 26,266 times. That's kind of cool. That's probably their #1 bestseller. No legal action was taken against the journal. None. Just the usual complaints. That doesn't count anymore. I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I'm not being investigated. And, importantly, the submission was identical to the replacement paper that Frontiers wanted from us, but then didn't take because they thought that they were too scared or something, that it was legally insufficient. Well, different journal published it, 26,000 downloads, no one has sued anyone. Make of that what you will. Here's the editor's story, very interesting. I received 4 emails from him. I'll tell you who he is in a minute. Long and convoluted with many additional documents. He called my department once or twice and told them to have me call him back. He called my office number as well a few times. I felt somewhat bothered by this, as I had stated a few times, that I don't see any problem with ethics, and why doesn't he submit a scholarly commentary? But he continued to email more and more detailed arguments. I haven't had any such reaction to articles before. I also haven't experienced such persistence in reaction to my own work on contested issues, including Holocaust denial, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and the Rwandan genocide. She can do all that, not a problem. You do climate denial, and you get this kind of behavior. And that individual in question, by the way, statistically, has tweeted something defamatory about me on average every 72 hours for the last 7 years. So, and look, if I'm off by, maybe, God knows, this is a rough statistic. But we're talking about, thousands of tweets out there about Lewandowski and my travesty. Incidentally, there's research showing that the dark triad and various other personality aspects are the main predictors of trolling, online trolling, sadism in particular. So on the basis of my experience, no surprises there. That's, we're talking about some fairly special characters there. And then lots more stuff happened, and I wrote a piece in a chapter that just came out a few months ago, summarizing the whole experience I was telling you about, which you can read. But I want to conclude by drawing a few lessons, because I think this sort of experience, I always try to learn from everything. And so here are a couple of lessons, 3 separate lessons in the last remaining few minutes. First of all, this could happen to anyone. Now, if you work on lexical decision in Serbo-Croatian, it's unlikely. But you work on anything that can become contested overnight, and you never know ahead of time. This can happen to you. It doesn't matter whether you're a medical scientist, a psychologist, a climate scientist, a geologist. I've had conversations with ornithologists who were in similar situations, because they counted birds that were at risk from a development in Dallas, Texas. Well, don't do that, because the developers will do this to you. Okay? So this happens all the time. What can you expect? Well, the most important thing is you have to realize from the outset that Gricean maxims or anything else you've ever learned about human beings does not apply. It really doesn't. I mean, you cannot have a mental model of what to expect, because anything can happen or the exact opposite. The only thing you know is that something will happen and you have no idea what it is. You just cannot anticipate it, and once it starts, you have to, I'll get to that, there's stuff you can do, but you cannot make conversational, conventional assumptions about the behavior of people who are actively engaged in denial for political or personal reasons. Some people are crazy. But no one else will realize this, and you can't tell them. Because if you walk into the office of the vice chancellor and you say, hey, Fred, you know what? The crazies are out to get me. That doesn't work too well, okay? That may raise eyebrows. You can never say that, even though some of the people are crazy. The best you can do is to present the evidence, and then if you're lucky, the vice chancellor will himself or herself be insulted and learn the lesson on their own. But you can't tell them that. That's sort of a little bit sad, because often I just want to tell people. There will be more fog out there than you can possibly imagine. I mean, you just heard 0.1% of the tip of the iceberg. No one will be able to keep track of this, except for yourself. And it's your responsibility to keep track of this stuff. No one will read anything you send them. The journal editors will not read your email. Your vice chancellor will not read your email. Your colleagues will not read your email past the first paragraph. No one reads anything. Okay? Just accept that. So if you write an email, 2 sentences max. And if you have more to say, then you write more emails spaced apart. Make use of the spacing effect. And do not overload people, because no one reads anything. The other thing that'll happen is that they will find errors in your work. If there's 100 people out there crawling through the internet, and every single data point, and every single analysis, and every single sentence, and the semicolons in your tables, they will find errors. They found errors in my work, they'll find errors in your work. Don't kid yourself. They will find it. So that's what you can expect. What is it you should resist? What is it you shouldn't do? Well, don't ignore it. If you're subject of these to these attacks, don't ignore it. They won't go away. They'll never leave you alone. I still get the occasional email 7 years later, you know, from, it's always the same people. I'm the content of their life. You know, they have nothing else to do but to send emails to Lewandowsky. Do not engage. Don't talk to them. Gricean maxims do not apply. Whatever you say will be used against you by being twisted. You cannot communicate in a way that is crank-proof. It cannot be done. Do not engage. Do not think that you will ever be transparent enough. If you post your data, they'll accuse you of hiding data. If you then say, no, I gave you everything, they'll say, ha, you're defending yourself. You will never provide enough information. If you send them all your email from this year, they'll ask for your email from 10 years ago to check whether you've ever been in the same supermarket checkout line as Al Gore, because that would explain where the data came from. You cannot be transparent enough. Do not expect anyone to read anything you send them. That is, to me, the most important lesson I learned in all this. Lawyers, don't read stuff. Vice chancellors, don't read stuff. No one reads anything. Trust me. In these situations, people do not read anything. Do not expect anyone to remember a commitment or act on it. Again, just don't expect it. If it happens, that's great, and it's happened to me a few times. But do not expect it, because then you just get disappointed. And think and realize that everybody is winging it all of the time. No one has a plan. No one is making decisions. No one is having a strategy. No one knows what they're doing. They're just winging it. The phone goes, oh, it's a crank, Lewandowsky. Ooh, what are we going to do? Oh, okay. Then they type something, and out comes some sausage or some hot dog that's completely unrelated to the issue at hand. People don't think. That has been my experience in that context. And I'm not being facetious here. I think that is true. There is no such thing as crisis management. They're just people sitting there winging it in between 300 other emails they're supposed to read or send. That's the reality of it.